Nobody expected the call that would change everything after a routine afternoon stop at a gas station just outside Dallas, Texas, where the heat rose off the asphalt in wavering waves and the sound of passing cars mixed with the low hum of neon lights struggling against daylight. Inside that small station, Emily Carter stood near the counter holding a half-open bottle of water, her posture calm but distant, like someone who had learned how to exist without drawing attention, wearing a simple grey hoodie and faded jeans that made her blend into the background of an ordinary day that was about to become anything but ordinary. Outside, a black and white patrol car rolled in slowly, tires crunching over gravel, and Officer Brian Mitchell stepped out first, followed by Officer Sarah Collins, both scanning the area with the kind of certainty that comes from believing the situation is already understood before it is even fully seen. Mitchell's voice cut through the ambient noise as he pointed toward Emily without hesitation, saying she matched the description they had received moments earlier over dispatch, though no one inside the station could tell exactly what description that was or why it mattered. Emily looked up at the sound of her name being called without warning, her expression steady but alert, as if she had been preparing for something like this longer than anyone realized, and when she took a slow step forward to clarify the misunderstanding, Mitchell raised his hand and instructed her to remain where she was while they sorted things out. The people inside the gas station began to notice then, phones slowly rising, curiosity turning into silent recording, while Sarah Collins positioned herself slightly behind Emily, her hand resting near her radio as if waiting for confirmation from a script no one else could hear. Emily spoke calmly, her voice measured and controlled, saying she was simply there to make a purchase and had done nothing to warrant being treated as a suspect, but Mitchell's attention remained fixed, his judgment already forming a shape that left little room for interruption. The air inside the station grew heavier, not from noise or movement but from the stillness that happens when everyone senses a line has been crossed but no one is sure who drew it first. Outside, the sunlight reflected off the windshield of the patrol car in sharp fragments, flickering across Emily's face as she stood there under scrutiny that felt heavier than the Texas heat itself. Then, without raising her voice, Emily said something that shifted the rhythm of the moment entirely, something so unexpected that even the officers paused for a fraction of a second, as if the air itself had briefly lost its direction. She looked directly at Mitchell and told him, with quiet certainty, that this situation had already reached a level he was not fully seeing yet, and that continuing down this path would trigger responses far beyond the scope of a routine stop. For a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound was the distant hiss of fuel pumps cycling at the edge of the station, while Emily Carter stood completely still in the center of a situation that was beginning to tilt in ways no one there understood yet. The silence inside the gas station stretched longer than anyone expected, like time itself had slowed down to study what was unfolding under the flickering fluorescent lights, while Emily Carter remained completely still, her eyes moving calmly between Officer Brian Mitchell and Officer Sarah Collins as if she were measuring not their authority but the distance between their certainty and reality. Mitchell stepped slightly closer, adjusting his stance in a way that suggested control, repeating that this was a standard identification procedure, yet the tone of his voice carried something less procedural and more instinctive, as though he had already decided where this moment would end before it had truly begun. Emily did not resist, did not raise her voice, and did not step backward. She simply placed her water bottle on the counter with deliberate calm and said once more that there had been a misunderstanding, but her words seemed to pass through the officers without landing where they were intended. Behind her, the store clerk slowly lowered his gaze to his phone, quietly recording, while a customer near the entrance took a step back as if instinctively avoiding the center of gravity in the room. Sarah Collins spoke into her radio in a low voice, requesting confirmation on the situation, and the words she used were careful, almost rehearsed, but the slight hesitation between phrases revealed uncertainty that did not match the confidence of their arrival. Emily exhaled slowly, her expression unchanged, then repeated something softer, stating that she had already informed the relevant channels and that escalation would depend entirely on whether protocol was being followed correctly at this moment, a statement that caused Mitchell to glance at her more closely for the first time without interruption. Outside, the Texas sun pressed harder against the pavement, heat shimmering across the windshield of the patrol car, and the reflection distorted everything inside the gas station into wavering shapes of light and shadow. A customer whispered that maybe she was exaggerating, another suggested she looked too calm for someone in trouble, and that contradiction only deepened the confusion in the room, because nothing about her behavior aligned with what they expected from someone in her position. Mitchell finally signaled for her identification, insisting again that cooperation would resolve everything quickly, but Emily simply nodded slightly and said that identification would not be the issue. What mattered was whether the correct authorization chain had been triggered before action was taken. That phrase, quiet and precise, introduced a shift that neither officer acknowledged openly but both reacted to internally, as Collins briefly looked down at her radio again while Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For a brief moment, the gas station felt smaller, as if the walls had moved inward around a situation that was no longer routine, and Emily Carter stood at the center of it with an unbroken calm that made every assumption around her feel less stable than before. The atmosphere inside the gas station had shifted again, no longer just tense but quietly unstable, as if every person present was waiting for a signal they could not see, while Emily Carter remained composed in the exact center of that uncertainty, her gaze steady and controlled, following Officer Brian Mitchell as he stepped slightly to the side to speak in a lower tone with Officer Sarah Collins. Their conversation was not fully audible, but fragments of urgency slipped through, words like verification, dispatch, and confirmation repeating in a pattern that suggested their earlier confidence was beginning to fracture. Collins kept one hand near her radio, listening more than speaking now, her posture subtly changed from assertion to caution, while Mitchell glanced toward Emily again with a new layer of hesitation that had not been there before. Emily noticed everything but reacted to nothing, maintaining the same calm presence, as though she had already accounted for every possible direction this encounter could take. A man near the refrigerated drinks section lowered his phone slightly, whispering that something about this did not feel like a normal stop anymore, and the clerk behind the counter stopped pretending to organize items, now watching with fixed attention. Mitchell finally returned his focus to Emily and asked her again for identification, but this time his voice carried less certainty and more procedural reliance, as if following steps rather than enforcing judgment. Emily nodded once and said her identification had already been registered under a secure protocol earlier in the day, and that any proper inquiry would reflect that record, a statement that caused Collins to briefly glance at Mitchell before quickly looking away again. The sound of a notification echoed from Collins's radio unit, sharp and immediate, breaking the fragile rhythm of the moment, and she lifted it closer to her ear without hesitation. The message came through in a formal tone, instructing immediate reassessment of the situation and pausing any escalation until further confirmation was received, and although the language was neutral, its effect in the room was immediate. Mitchell's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition that the situation was no longer contained within his authority. Emily remained still, her hands relaxed. At her sides, her attention fixed not on the officers but on the unfolding chain of communication that had now clearly moved beyond the local level. Outside, the reflection of passing vehicles stretched across the glass windows of the gas station, distorting into long streaks of light that moved like silent warnings across the floor. The people inside instinctively became quieter, their curiosity replaced with uncertainty, as the presence of official communication disrupted the narrative they had assumed they were witnessing. Collins spoke again into her radio, confirming receipt, and her tone now carried a careful precision that matched the shift in authority happening in real time. Mitchell took a slow breath, adjusting his stance once more, as if recalibrating his understanding of the entire situation, while Emily finally spoke again, her voice even and deliberate, stating that the matter would resolve itself once the correct oversight channel completed its review. For the first time since the encounter began, neither officer responded immediately, and in that brief pause the gas station felt suspended between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed. The moment the radio transmission ended, the gas station seemed to hold its breath in a way that felt almost physical, as if even the flickering lights above the counter had slowed their rhythm to match the uncertainty now spreading through the room, while Emily Carter remained exactly where she had been standing, calm and unmoving, her presence no longer reading as passive but instead as something carefully anchored in control. Officer Sarah Collins lowered her radio slightly, her eyes shifting between the device in her hand and Officer Brian Mitchell, who was now visibly recalculating the situation without speaking aloud. The certainty he had carried earlier had thinned into something more fragile, replaced by a quiet awareness that external oversight had already begun to intersect with their actions. Mitchell glanced toward Emily again, this time with less authority in his posture and more observation, as if trying to understand what he had missed rather than enforce what he believed. Emily did not interrupt the silence, did not add explanation, and did not attempt to assert herself further. She simply maintained her steady stance, allowing the unfolding process to continue without resistance or urgency. A second notification arrived almost immediately after the first, this one more detailed, instructing a full pause on any formal action until identity verification was completed through a secure federal channel, and the wording carried an unmistakable weight that shifted the entire atmosphere inside the station. Collins inhaled slowly, her attention now fully locked on the information, while Mitchell subtly adjusted his footing, no longer positioning himself as the one directing the situation but rather as someone waiting for instruction. The customers inside the station had become almost completely silent, their phones still raised but their expressions changing from curiosity to uncertainty, as the energy in the room transformed from public incident to controlled procedure. Emily finally moved for the first time in several minutes, not toward the officers but slightly to the side, aligning herself closer to the counter as if acknowledging the pause without conceding her composure. She spoke softly, stating that proper protocol would resolve the matter efficiently and that escalation had already ensured accuracy would replace assumption, her tone calm enough that it did not challenge the officers directly but firm enough that it reframed the situation entirely. Mitchell did not respond immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was lower, more measured, asking for clarification from dispatch rather than issuing further commands, signaling a clear shift in authority dynamics that had not been present when the encounter began. Collins confirmed that they were now awaiting direct confirmation from a higher federal channel, and as she spoke those words, the weight of the situation became unmistakably different, no longer localized or routine but part of a structured response that extended beyond their immediate control. Outside, the bright Texas sunlight continued to glare off the asphalt, but inside the gas station, the lighting felt colder, sharper, and more distant, as if the space itself had been redefined by the information now circulating through official channels. Emily's expression remained unchanged, her calm presence steady against the shifting reactions around her, while Officer Mitchell finally stepped half a pace back, not in retreat but in reassessment, acknowledging without words that the situation had moved beyond his original assumption and into a level of oversight that required patience rather than action. The stillness that had settled inside the gas station no longer felt like hesitation but like a suspended decision waiting for confirmation from somewhere far beyond the walls of the building, while Emily Carter remained composed at the counter, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now seemed less like passivity and more like controlled certainty. Officer Sarah Collins held her radio closer, listening as another secure transmission came through, this time slower, more deliberate, carrying the unmistakable structure of a high-level federal verification process. The words were not dramatic, yet their impact in the room was immediate, instructing full compliance with a 5-minute confirmation window before any further procedural steps could be taken. Officer Brian Mitchell did not speak at first, his attention fixed on the radio as if trying to understand how quickly the situation had moved beyond his authority, while the earlier confidence he carried had now been replaced by careful restraint. Emily finally broke her silence, not with explanation but with simple acknowledgement, stating that the timing aligned with standard response thresholds for federal escalation, her voice calm and measured, offering no emotion that could be interpreted as pressure or defense. Around them, the people inside the gas station had stopped pretending to continue their routines, their attention fully locked onto the exchange unfolding in front of them, phones still raised but movement slower, as if everyone instinctively understood that what they were witnessing was no longer an ordinary local encounter. Collins confirmed aloud that they were now inside an active verification window, and her tone reflected a shift from enforcement to procedure, each word chosen carefully as if avoiding any assumption that could later be corrected. Mitchell stepped slightly to the side, glancing toward the patrol car outside as if expecting additional instruction to arrive physically rather than through the radio, his posture now more aligned with waiting than directing. Emily adjusted her position subtly, turning her gaze toward the glass entrance where sunlight reflected off passing vehicles, the brightness outside contrasting sharply with the quiet tension inside, and she stated again that once the verification cycle completed, all actions would be reviewed under federal protocol standards. A statement that neither challenged nor provoked but instead reframed the entire situation as something already in motion beyond their control. The radio emitted a soft tone indicating countdown initiation, marking the beginning of the 5-minute confirmation process, and that sound alone seemed to compress the room further into silence. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence, the shift became undeniable, not through confrontation but through structure, as authority itself appeared to move away from the officers standing in the room and toward a system operating far outside of it. Emily Carter remained still, her expression unchanged, while Officer Mitchell finally lowered his gaze slightly, no longer focused on enforcement but on understanding the implications of what had just been confirmed, and Officer Collins continued to monitor the radio without further comment, both of them now waiting inside a process that had already begun without their initiation. The countdown inside the gas station continued silently through the radio system, not announced in any dramatic way but present in the background like an invisible structure holding the entire moment together, while Emily Carter remained still at the counter, her calm presence unchanged even as the atmosphere around her shifted into a state of official verification. Officer Sarah Collins stood with her attention fixed on the radio unit, listening as periodic updates confirmed that the federal confirmation request had been received and was now being processed through secure channels, each message reinforcing that the situation was no longer local in scope but part of a higher-level authorization review. Officer Brian Mitchell no longer attempted to assert control over the interaction, instead standing with measured stillness, his posture reflecting careful observation rather than enforcement, as if he understood that any premature action would only complicate a process already in motion beyond his jurisdiction. Emily's gaze moved briefly toward the glass doors of the station, where the bright Texas afternoon light continued to pour in, contrasting sharply with the quiet, enclosed tension inside, and she spoke softly again, stating that verification cycles of this nature typically required precise alignment between field status and federal records, her tone calm and factual without any emotional emphasis. The people inside the station had grown completely quiet now, their earlier curiosity replaced by a sense of restrained attention, phones still held up but with less movement, as if even recording the moment required careful consideration. Collins acknowledged another incoming signal, her expression tightening slightly as she confirmed that the system had escalated the request into direct federal review status, and the phrasing of the message indicated that response authorization was being cross-checked across multiple secure databases. Mitchell exhaled slowly, shifting his weight but not speaking, his focus now divided between the radio updates and Emily herself, as though trying to reconcile the simplicity of her presence with the complexity of the system now responding to it. Emily remained composed, her hands relaxed, her posture steady, and when she spoke again it was only to acknowledge that once federal confirmation completed, any misunderstanding would be corrected through standard procedural resolution rather than local interpretation. The radio emitted a subtle tone indicating a status update, and Collins immediately lifted it closer, listening without interruption as the voice on the other end confirmed that the identity verification process had reached the final cross-reference stage. In that moment, the gas station felt even smaller, not physically but perceptually, as if all external noise had been reduced to a distant background hum, leaving only the quiet weight of structured authority unfolding in real time. Mitchell glanced briefly toward the entrance again, then back to Emily, his expression now neutral but focused, while Collins lowered the radio slightly after acknowledging receipt of the update. Emily did not react to the information directly, instead maintaining the same steady presence she had held since the beginning, and in that consistency, the environment around her seemed to settle into a more defined order, where uncertainty was gradually being replaced by procedural clarity, and everyone present understood that the next update would determine the final direction of the entire situation. The final phase of the verification cycle unfolded inside the gas station with a quiet intensity that no one present could fully interrupt or redirect, as the radio system delivered a steady stream of confirmation updates indicating that cross-reference checks between federal identity databases and field reports were now actively converging toward a final authorization decision. Emily Carter stood in the same position she had maintained from the beginning, her calm demeanor unchanged, her attention resting not on the officers directly but on the space beyond them, as if she were already aware that the outcome was no longer being shaped by local interpretation but by a structured national-level review process. Officer Sarah Collins listened closely to the incoming transmission, her expression shifting subtly as the language of the update became more definitive, confirming that identity validation had matched a protected classification profile and that procedural clearance was being prepared for immediate instruction delivery. Officer Brian Mitchell remained silent for several seconds, his posture steady but no longer assertive, reflecting a complete transition from control to observation, as the situation he had initially approached as routine enforcement now existed within a framework far beyond his operational authority. Inside the station, the ambient noise of everyday activity had fully disappeared, replaced by a focused stillness where even the smallest movements felt amplified, and the customers who had been recording earlier now held their phones more steadily, as if instinctively recognizing that the moment had shifted from speculation to resolution. Collins received another secured message, her eyes narrowing slightly as she confirmed the final stage acknowledgement, which stated that authorization status had been elevated to immediate compliance protocol, effectively concluding the verification sequence. Mitchell exhaled slowly, glancing once more toward Emily, his expression no longer carrying judgment or certainty, but instead a measured awareness that the situation had resolved in a direction that required no further action from him. Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady and calm, acknowledging that once verification reached completion, procedural closure would follow without further need for intervention, her words carrying a quiet confidence that matched the structure of the process now concluding around her. The radio emitted a final confirmation tone, different from the earlier updates, signaling that the identity validation had been fully completed and formally accepted across all required channels, and in response Collins lowered the device slightly, her posture easing into stillness as she processed the final instruction set. For a brief moment, no one moved, as if the entire room was aligning itself with the completion of an unseen system that had been operating throughout the encounter. The gas station, once filled with uncertainty and fragmented assumptions, now felt defined by resolution, not through confrontation but through confirmation, and Emily Carter remained at the center of it all, unchanged, composed, and steady as the structure around her settled into final procedural closure. The final confirmation settled over the gas station like a quiet wave that did not announce itself with celebration or noise, but instead with a complete structural shift in how every person in the room now understood what had just taken place, as Officer Sarah Collins lowered her radio fully for the first time since the encounter began, acknowledging that the federal verification cycle had officially reached closure status. Officer Brian Mitchell remained still, his posture no longer shaped by authority or direction, but by a calm recognition that the situation had moved entirely beyond his responsibility and into a resolved procedural outcome that required no further intervention. Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been throughout the entire sequence, her presence unchanged, her composure steady, as if the conclusion had simply confirmed what she had already known from the beginning rather than introduced anything new. The people inside the gas station slowly began to lower their phones, their attention shifting from recording to processing, as the weight of what they had witnessed transitioned from uncertainty into quiet understanding. Collins spoke briefly, confirming aloud that all required channels had returned clearance status and that the field situation was now officially closed under federal acknowledgement, her tone neutral but precise, reflecting the formality of the resolution. Mitchell nodded once without speaking, his eyes briefly scanning the environment as if reorienting himself to a normal setting that no longer required evaluation or enforcement. Emily finally turned slightly toward the exit, her movement slow and deliberate, and for the first time since the beginning of the encounter, she was no longer being observed as a subject of investigation but as a person moving freely through a resolved moment. Outside, the Texas sunlight remained unchanged, bright and steady over the asphalt and fuel pumps, yet the contrast between the ordinary world outside and the extraordinary procedural event that had just concluded inside the station created a lingering sense of dissonance for everyone who had been present. Collins stepped back toward the patrol car, placing the radio back in its mount, while Mitchell remained near the entrance for a moment longer, his expression neutral but reflective, as if mentally reviewing the sequence of events that had unfolded. Beyond his initial understanding, Emily walked past them without urgency, her steps calm and measured, and no one attempted to stop her or speak further, as the structure of authority that had defined the moment had already shifted into completed status. As she reached the edge of the station lot, the sound of normal traffic gradually filled the space again, replacing the earlier silence, and the scene began to return to its ordinary rhythm, though nothing about the perception of those who had witnessed it remained entirely the same. Mitchell finally turned away and exhaled slowly, while Collins checked one last notification confirming formal closure, and both officers understood without needing to say it that what had occurred was not just an enforcement event, but a reminder that authority in this case had operated on a level far beyond what had been visible at the start. The quiet return of normal sound outside the gas station did not feel immediate, but gradual, as if the world itself was carefully reintroducing itself after holding its breath for too long, while Emily Carter continued walking away from the entrance with steady, unhurried steps, her presence no longer framed by uncertainty or scrutiny but by the simple reality of someone who had already passed through a system that no longer required attention. Behind her, Officer Sarah Collins stood near the patrol car for a moment longer, checking the final status confirmation on her device one last time, confirming that the federal case reference had been officially marked as closed with no further action required, while Officer Brian Mitchell remained near the doorway, his gaze following Emily for a few seconds before he finally turned slightly away, as if accepting that the moment had fully ended. Inside the gas station, the remaining customers slowly lowered their phones completely, some exchanging brief glances with each other, but most choosing silence over commentary, as if instinctively understanding that what they had witnessed was not something that could be fully explained through casual reaction. Emily reached the edge of the parking lot where the sunlight was strongest, and for a brief moment she paused, not to look back at the officers, but simply to adjust her direction toward the road ahead, her posture unchanged and composed, carrying no visible trace of the procedural weight that had surrounded her only minutes earlier. The patrol car engine started softly behind her, not as an urgent departure but as a routine return to duty status, and Collins entered the passenger seat without further conversation, her attention already moving away from the incident and back into operational normalcy. Mitchell remained outside for a final moment, watching the empty space where the interaction had taken place, as if mentally replaying the sequence not to question it, but to understand how quickly authority could shift into structured silence without confrontation or resistance. Emily then continued forward along the sidewalk, her figure gradually blending into the everyday movement of the surrounding area, passing other vehicles and distant pedestrians who had no awareness of what had just occurred only moments before. The gas station behind her slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, with fuel pumps operating, doors opening and closing, and background conversations resuming in fragments that no longer carried the weight of tension. Officer Mitchell finally turned fully toward the patrol car and stepped inside, closing the door with a controlled motion, while Collins initiated departure protocol, confirming that all documentation had been transmitted and archived according to procedure. As the vehicle pulled away from the station, there was no further discussion between them, only the quiet acknowledgement that the situation had concluded not through escalation, but through verification and closure at a level beyond their direct control. Emily Carter continued walking until she reached the next corner, where she disappeared into the flow of normal afternoon traffic, her presence no longer marked by attention or scrutiny, but simply becoming part of the city again, while behind her the gas station remained unchanged on the surface, even though everyone who had witnessed the moment understood that something within that ordinary space had briefly operated on a completely different level of authority and resolution.